Cool. All right, we got a bunch of attendees joining on. Thanks for everybody joining. We're just about to kick it off. So happy, I don't know, what is it? Thursday. It's hard to keep track. All right, I will share my screen and we're good to kick it off. If you can hear the bells in the background, it's kind of interesting where I'm located. I have two churches next to the building I'm in, so I get church bells all day long reminding me when to start meetings. So it's pretty funny. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
All right, great. I'll kick it off today. Just to highlight today, partnership between Blumira and Worldwide Technology. We'll be discussing detecting and responding to Microsoft threats. And hopping into both on-premise, server, and cloud type of detections and use cases. And it's great, first off, just to be working with Worldwide Technology, and to introduce Jeff Heim, Security Solutions Architect. Jeff, do you want to give a little bit of your background and some of the things that you're excited about talking with us today about?
Sure. Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, Jeff Heim. I'm a solutions architect, primarily focused on security. I've got about 10 years experience as a network engineer, always with a security take on, any role I've had. It's always been, how do we harden this device, or how do we improve posture, those types of things. At WWT, we focus on secure business outcomes. And so we try to align technology to actually helping improve the business and their security. So I'm excited to be partnered with Blumira. We're always looking for innovative solutions to help meet customer needs and current challenges. And we think this product is really going to kind of change the way customers do their SIEM or SOAR automation and response.
Awesome. It's great to have you. I'm looking forward to the discussion. I know you have a lot of background in working in different environments and with a lot of different customers. So, and then myself, VP Operations at Blumira, have been at Blumira over a year. Prior to that, spent 8 years at Duo Security. And I like to equate, for a lot of people that have experienced Duo, really at Blumira, one of the things that attracted me is taking some of the same principles and approaches to security and making it accessible and easy. So we'll hop into that a little bit later, but first we're going to kick it off and talk about some of the different Microsoft stacks and some of the different areas where there might be things to consider from a detection and response perspective. And so I think the first one that comes to mind for me is Microsoft Azure and the cloud infrastructure platform. So, curious, Jeff, like as you're talking with different organizations, what type of adoption do you see with Azure, and what types of concerns do people have?
So I would say, when we talk about the three major cloud providers, Azure is definitely in the top two. I would say in markets that we support in the West, in my region, like Alaska and other places, Azure might be number one. And, we see really heavy adoption. It's pretty much not an if or when, but, how at this point everybody's putting together their multi-cloud strategy. A lot of customers are already there, and now it's just a matter of kind of improving and increasing that presence and just trying to figure out what works for different organizations. So it's prevalent everywhere.
Yeah, and I kind of same here, and I think Microsoft was a little bit late early on in the cloud infrastructure play. We saw a ton of adoption with AWS many years back, but really I think Microsoft tends to service most organizations across the world, and people tend to lean towards their solutions. So it makes a lot of sense on the cloud infrastructure side. Some of the things I want to talk about just on the Azure side is like, one of the things as you move to cloud infrastructure is it just opens up a whole nother can of worms from a security perspective. And so that's one of the reasons we're talking today. And some of the things that maybe get overlooked or things that people aren't necessarily paying attention to is the fact that everything essentially is not everything, but by default, but a lot of things are accessible via the internet. Whereas in a lot of cases, your infrastructure, applications and services wouldn't be. So that's definitely an angle for a lot of organizations to consider. And then just the aspect where cloud infrastructure is new, and so there's a lot of different pieces and parts and controls that people aren't necessarily educated on. Comes into play a lot too, as you're talking about these newer technologies. So as we hop in, we'll kind of go through a few different thoughts or concepts, and curious what else comes to your mind as well as we're talking about Azure. Some of the things that I look at are just in general, like similar techniques and tactics just being transferred from remote access or on-premise capabilities to the cloud. So in Azure's instance, things like PowerShell access attempts and password spraying come to mind a lot of times as far as techniques and tactics used to try and get a foothold or gain access to these systems. And so if you think about it, PowerShell is essentially a way to run scripts to get access and make configuration changes to your infrastructure. And the fact that a lot of times you can do this via, for instance, the public internet definitely increases the exposure and the risk. Are some of the things that I've seen. And then I think you mentioned some things similar, more on the data side when we were talking before. Is that correct?
Yeah, so when we talk about, on AWS, it's pretty well known, all of the, S3 buckets, leaky buckets that have been exposed, and all of the different types of data dumps that are related to that. In Azure, it's very similar with storage containers and blobs, which is their object storage. By default, it's pretty secure. It's really a matter of if somebody misconfigures a blob or if they unintentionally expose this data. There's a lot of websites that actually, find this data. They're always looking, and any publicly accessible data can be exposed. And so that's another way that we're seeing, vulnerabilities occur in this environment. And then, just talking about PowerShell, on a desktop, or if you have some kind of endpoint product, it's usually, easy to detect, PowerShell and being used in a nefarious way. But, in an Azure environment, that's pretty commonplace. And so it's really a matter of having visibility and, being able to detect anomalous behavior and having some kind of, machine learning or AI type of engine to detect those sort of things. And then without, MFA or, complex password policies, if you have just 8 to 10 characters and it's simplified, password spraying is very effective. Compared to traditional, more brute force methods that would lock out accounts, where you're just, you've got, hundreds of names and you're using, single passwords, so you're not getting locked out and those sort of things. So these are very common attack vectors.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing is, with a lot of the technology, things like MFA aren't always on by default. I know that Microsoft has attempted to push that much further, so it's more natural to be on. But yeah, very, very often, whether it's a VPN or whether it's Azure Access or Office 365, maybe a misconfiguration results in no MFA on a user or an account, and the next thing you know, organization can an attacker can gain access. And then one of the things this thing will come up throughout is a lot of times indications of compromise are discovered or found in the aspect of spinning new things up. And so, I put down here one good example is within Azure, a new Azure domain controller agent being spun up is a good example of something you should validate, because that's not an activity you would be doing often, but essentially that basically could give someone got access to your whole environment. And I think also a good example would be like new domain admins being created could be a common indicator that maybe someone's getting ready to deploy ransomware or is within your environment that shouldn't be, that you should be auditing and validating when those events happen. Any other thoughts on Azure before we hop to some of the other angles?
Yes, but they're going to be related to other topics. So, you mentioned AD and Azure AD, and just, basically, if you have, domain admin credentials, you're getting the keys to the castle. That's a really powerful thing. And if you want to, establish persistence and, basically live off the land, being a domain admin is a great way to do that.
Yeah, and I think the reality on that is living off the land's a true thing. Like normally, I think statistically speaking, during an incident or breach, um, the average organization has someone dwelling or existing in their environment for somewhere around 200 and some days before the actual like end state of attack, which is pretty wild. And I think the reality is a lot of times people lack visibility into very often lack visibility into these types of tactics or techniques. So we're going to stay in the cloud theme and shift over to Office 365. Curious to see and hear about adoption that you see across the platform. We see very, very common, but certainly one of the number one places where people are looking to start to get a foothold and do discovery to get access to different things within the environment. So curious, your experience with the platform and some of the observations of risk.
Yeah, I mean, heavy adoption. I think, probably 95% of the Fortune 1000 is using, Microsoft or Office to some degree. And so, wide adoption everywhere. I think that number is also true for Active Directory as well, for directory services. But, sometimes even though this is sort of focused on email and spear phishing and business email compromise, a lot of times we overlook some of these collaboration tools that have data stored, like Teams with SharePoint on the back end, and just some of the data exfiltration and compromise that can occur there as well.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like, you can now share with external people very easily documents, for example, and they're designed to be collaborative, but by doing that, it introduces some risk to the organization. So I think there's a good aspect of data loss prevention, and not to mention like DLP necessarily, but just in general, there's a much higher risk of data loss with a user making a mistake compared to some of the more traditional on-premise architectures. Um, and I think that the top one I mentioned is a good example of that, where mailbox rule creation often isn't someone does frequently, and there are real reasons to do it, but anyone can go and create mailbox rules essentially by default. And some of those rules are incredibly risky. So like forwarding email, why would someone in a corporate setting want to do that? Well, if you're in politics, that was common practice. I'm kind of joking in the past, but no, the reality is like auditing when someone creates a rule is a good example of something a security team or an IT team should actually be doing to make sure that there's a real intended business purpose, because ultimately that rule might just be an attacker trying to forward email for data exfiltration to get access to different accounts in a greater scheme of an attack, right? So I think that aligns with some of the things you're talking about in regards to risks of these collaboration suites.
Yeah, and then the rule creation, that's a real good example of where it's very important to have that layer of visibility, and also be able to go and kind of re-step through the breadcrumbs and the trails to figure out when something happens, having those logs and that level of auditing.
Yep. Yeah, the other thing I would say, and this applies to Azure and other platforms, is like there is some pretty low hanging fruit, and it depends on the organization. But if you're regionalized, for instance, to US or US and Canada, just even looking at things like who's logging in or trying to log in from places outside those areas gives you a pretty good indication of organizations that might or bad actors, right, that might be trying to attack you or are successful. And so I would say a combination of geo, although not, not always, the more you can necessary for some organizations that are extremely distributed. Most organizations like small businesses and medium-sized businesses, if they can actually get down to a limited amount of access, or at least be aware when someone's accessing outside of the region that they operate in, it is a good way to get indicators of risk and compromise as well there. So I do think too, document sharing, like having that ability to document share is a good example too, where it's like, well, if someone does share a document with an external source, a security team probably wants to look into, is that actually you know, the right intention from a business perspective, or is it a mistake, or does someone potentially now have access that could be an attacker from a risk perspective too? So pretty important.
Yeah, definitely. I was just going to go back to the geolocation. I've seen it to where somebody scanned in a physical badge into a building while logged in from Ukraine or something, and obviously there's challenges there. That's definitely probably somebody that got popped, but it's harder to detect where users are coming in other than two same logins from different geolocations. Having a baseline of just somebody logging in from a remote place, where everyone's working from home, and so you have to be able to correlate some of that stuff and have some intelligence applied there.
Yep, absolutely. On that note, I've also seen where people actually hired out their job.
Yeah.
And they're doing some of it, and then someone else is somewhere else, and have seen it be a HR issue at the end of the day, and a real security risk to the business, right? And I think the other thing is in the past, I think this is less relevant nowadays, but and Geo Impossible, there has also been instances where people went on vacation and logged in right before, and then as they land, they're like, why are you all suddenly logging in from this new location when you're not even supposed to be on vacation? Types of scenarios. So it is, for right or wrong, there's some aspect of things that can go on with an environment that are good indication that it's non-normal activity with Geo. So moving on, Windows Server, and I think Windows Server, this is where you kind of cross, where this could be in Azure, this could be in an on-premise environment, it could be in AWS or GCP, but more on the host side as it relates to Microsoft. So historically speaking, I'm curious to hear your experiences regarding Windows Server, and some of the things people have to be mindful of to take care of and reduce risk here.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it all boils down to, whenever you talk about these types of vulnerabilities, especially ones that, focus on remote code execution, impacting RDP in the case of Bluekeep, or SMB shares or Excel files, that sort of thing. Patching is of the utmost importance. It's not very sexy. It's a pretty boring thing to do, but if you can, maintain patching and just do the basic hygiene, disable services, make sure you're doing regular scans to make sure things like RDP aren't open publicly, and those types of connections, those are the types of things that, it's not really fun to talk about, but it's very important to maintain.
Yep. Yeah, I think it's a combination of like keeping patched and staying up to date is important. Reality is that doesn't always happen, and there's also good reason behind sometimes why it doesn't happen. I think as you start looking at things like industrial control systems that run on Windows, or legacy applications, unfortunately, there can be a tremendous cost to buying new software. Maybe it's not even software that's available anymore necessarily. So a lot of times you do see software that goes unpatched, and especially in areas like healthcare, manufacturing, and in OT environments, I'd say, that are pretty common. And so I think what's important there is patch everything and anything you can, especially when it's on the internet. but there are other ways to look for indicators of compromise for things that maybe go unpatched. And I think a combination of doing this through logs as well as different EDR tools, like Windows Defender, for example, are pretty good examples of ways to correlate and reduce security risks. So I threw two up here, and these are both remote exploits that you can essentially patch for. One of them being Bluekeep to gain remote access via RDP, which is, we'll talk about misconfigurations there, but very common way, especially once someone gets in an environment to then gain access to Windows servers. And then Cobalt Strike, paid penetration test tool that is often used in attacks as well, to kind of gain access to servers remotely too. And I think there's a ton of other stuff, you know, in regards to Windows servers as it relates to Active Directory and identity, but which we're going to talk about next. But certainly things to look for from a technique and tactic perspective when someone's within your environment or trying to gain access to your environment.
Yeah, and Cobalt Strike is a great example of an exploit kit that is used by, you know, red teamers, pen testers, but also the bad guys. It's super customizable and popular because it's able to evade, you know, traditional AV and other methods of sandboxing. So yeah, definitely you see that a lot. And there are ways to detect, you know, functions of that, but, you know, you need more advanced solution.
Yep. Now, kind of hopping a little bit further, Active Directory, of course, is a service that runs on Windows Server. You know, I think this also ties a bit to Azure AD when you're talking about these things too. We talked a little bit earlier about password spraying and brute force attacks. You know, one of the other things is just looking at who suddenly has new access to domain account admins or privileged access. That really, you know, starts to if you're not auditing it, a lot of times goes overlooked, and these are a lot of times late stage in ransomware attacks where they're about to deploy ransomware to every server or full infrastructure within a customer's environment. And there's a ton of other things you can detect via Active Directory, but a lot of times most organizations aren't monitoring much of anything as it relates to AD. Even though it really is the keys to the kingdom, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that touch AD. There's so many, you know, applications and, you know, services that run within the organization that AD plays a role in. And so if you have access to AD or domain admin credentials, I mean, that is the keys to the kingdom. So, you know, just doing things like, you know, having a PAM tool or having, you know, identity governance and lifecycle management, and just knowing what users you have, what they should have access to, you know, creating strong policies to audit these things and to continually monitor and audit, I think is really important.
Yep, absolutely. And the auditing piece, I think, goes overlooked a lot of times because it's you don't want to audit everything and everything, because if you do that, you'll go crazy. But we talked a little bit earlier about a new Azure directory spun up, or endpoint, a new domain admin, new privileged access that wasn't there before. Those are all essentially moving away from least privileged access if they don't go audited. And you know, from an approach perspective, there, you want to limit as much access as you can. That's not necessary. So, oh, the irony here, lack of MFA. Yeah, and then I think there's a slew of as you look at Microsoft Stack, common misconfigurations that just get overlooked time and time again. And I think there's a ton of them, but some of them that surface to me commonly, number one is RDP or SMB protocols, so remote access to servers or file shares over the internet. And I used to do this myself years ago, right? You'd put a Windows server online, you'd access it via RDP, you put two-factor on it, and you think everything's good. When in reality, like, it's really easy to gain access to that host. More than likely, especially as something goes unpatched for a short period of time. And so I think just the educational aspect of like, yeah, you should never expose these different protocols for Windows applications to the internet is one of the keys there that goes overlooked time and time again. And I think too, a lot of people aren't monitoring to even see if those protocols are available via the internet. So that's another pretty significant challenge for most organizations.
Yeah, and I just add, like, even internally, if somebody does get access and they're trying to land and expand and do lateral movement, just disabling services like link local multicast name resolution, WPAD, web proxy auto discovery, things like that really help reduce the amount of information that can be attained and to keep an attacker from jumping around.
Yeah, less is more in regards to features when you're looking at servers and IT infrastructure, right? And I think that's particularly important. And then putting them behind VPN or proxy of some sort is a great way to introduce a better layer of security there. And then the other one that I kind of laugh because I came from Duo Security, which did multi-factor authentication or two-factor, is how often, even when people buy a two-factor MFA solution or they have an existing one, it just doesn't get implemented across the board to everything is a pretty frequent thing that gets overlooked from a configuration standpoint.
Yeah, and also just really implementation and an easy adoption, right? Because a lot of times, MFA might not be applied to an application because of the friction involved in getting it deployed, and then also on the end user side of just becoming a pain and pretty arduous just to do a simple login. So any tools that you have like Duo, Okta, some of those products that kind of streamline those processes, make you more secure with less friction as a result.
Yep. Yeah, and I think it's making sure you kind of spend the time to try and audit where you can apply it, that it's going to increase security. But yeah, a lot of times too, it might just go unknown. On the RDP SMB side, I'll talk about this a little bit more as I get into our product, but we do a lot of proof of concepts and deployments, and I would say, and nobody should be ashamed of the RDP SMB side of things, probably about 30 to 40% of the time, when we do a proof of concept, like people have RDP or SMB exposed that don't realize it. And that's, it's just the reality of there's so much to consider from a tech stack perspective that things do end up getting misconfigured or overlooked. And so having the right tools to monitor for that stuff becomes important. And then the last slide on Microsoft Stack before I hop into a little bit about how Blumira ties into the Microsoft Stack, and what we do from a product perspective and service perspective is just hopping into the wildly confusing Microsoft world of products. And then also they changed all the names recently, so these are the newer names. But I do think, and there's more than this. I think this is the core that we see. There's a combination where customers don't have licensing for a lot of these capabilities, especially in the underserved market. And then often enterprises have these capabilities, but they go unused and or not fully adopted. And so, I just kind of want to walk through or talk through on the cloud infrastructure side, the key things there we see are you have Azure Active Directory Defender for Azure, which is anything with Defender for the most part, other than Defender by itself, is a higher tier license. And these are really good products. We found with our customers, the ones that use them, they do provide high value. And we recommend, if an organization can afford them, that they're good to consider. And this is a stack of technology that we integrate with as well, on the Microsoft side. And then you also have different APIs. So Microsoft has an API for every single service here, basically listed. But Cloud Security API is a big one that allows you to pull a ton of different information of what's going on within an Azure environment. And then as we get down to the endpoint side, there's Defender, which is a free product that really we suggest organizations use, which does monitoring on the host side. And then there's Defender for endpoints, which kind of correlates all that information centrally. And then on the productivity side, you have Office 365, which has its own logging and some security features, but then Defender for Office 365. And this isn't meant to be a pitch for all these products. I just trying to highlight, it's hard to understand what products do which things, and there's a lot of different options and alternatives in licensing. But one thing I would say is, from our approach at Blumira, we integrate across the board with all of them so that we can leverage and take advantage of those different pieces. So I don't know if there's anything else that comes to mind here, but these are the things we often see across different customers' environments implemented. Across the Azure stack, on-premise stack, and the Microsoft stack.
Yeah, I would just add that, within all these products, Microsoft does have tools, Azure Security Center, Azure Sentinel, a lot of things that can correlate and manage some of these products, but they're not always the most robust. Even if they are free, there are also costs. There's complexities involved. And with Blumira, it really ties in all of these data sources. These are all native integrations. So there's 11 listed here, and they can really correlate and help sort of get through all of this data and all of these different sources of security information, and help automate some of that as well.
Yeah, so let's hop into, as far as Blumira, our value proposition and partnership with Worldwide Technologies on how this works. So first off, our focus as far as our target customers, it tends to be organizations with limited security teams and resources. And so more or less the assumption that you're not going to know everything of the Azure stack and the Microsoft stack and how to correlate and surface the right threats or risks and what to do from an action perspective. And so essentially deducting down what's important for an organization to detect and respond is what we're helping our organizations do in an effective manner. And so eliminating the alert fatigue across the different technology stacks. And then there's a lot of manual process involved. If you want it, you should be doing detection and response. But the reality is if you want to, there's a lot of work with the traditional model in solutions out there today. Even in the instance we talked about Azure Sentinel, it's a good product, but you have to have a team of people that actually build workflows and decide what to detect and what to do. And that all comes down to time and typically money as well. And so I don't want to say that's not a useful tool. There certainly can be valuable, like some of the other SIEMs out there. It's just the complexity and sophistication that's required in time to be successful. So what we assume when we built our product was the product deploys in a matter of hours. A lot of times 1 to 2 hours within a full stack environment, and we're able to add value from a security perspective. And I'll talk about how that works. And then it eliminates a lot of the noise with existing products that we're integrating with, a lot of times associated with alert fatigue. And then helping organizations to take action by only requiring minimal IT skills. Doesn't require you to be a sophisticated security expert and know everything. And we can help both automate some of it as well as provide playbooks from a response perspective on what to do that are human readable. And essentially in that hour or two of deploying Blumira, essentially we start detecting threats. And I throw some of the more common ones up here that really tie back. And if I look at a ransomware attack, kind of curious, Jeff, like how often have you seen ransomware or a customer that they get hits with ransomware?
All the time. It's top concern. I mean, we've been talking about ransomware for 5 years and it's still going strong. It's gaining momentum. That's hard to believe.
Yeah. Yeah, and I kind of laugh cynically, but it's like, yeah, I think the adoption of accessibility of cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, and you start to see the price of it nowadays, and it's like, well, yeah, it made it more accessible to exfiltrate money from organizations or exploit them, which is unfortunate, but it does have a lot of risk to organizations, and mitigating early is important. And so what I like to highlight is the fact that like a ransomware attack, at least the ones I've broken down with customers when they do happen, a lot of times they'll start with recon scanning, privileged, or trying to do password spraying, brute force attacks, misconfigurations with remote access with RDP and SMB, exploits being run internally. And then normally towards the end, they start spinning up new domain account administrators. And the joy of this is like with Blumira, we're going to detect all those things I just mentioned and catch someone very early in an attack to prevent them from actually gaining access to hosts and servers, and getting to success from a ransomware perspective. So that's one of the key areas. Time and time again, we see a ton of value as it relates to our product. We do a lot more detection than this, but I like to highlight some of these more common use cases that are just seen time and time again. That organizations just aren't they don't have the visibility to identify or early stage in the attacks and stop them, if that's helpful.
I read a stat that said 90% of RCE executed on a machine was related to crypto mining, and so you counter that distributed mining with ransomware that's also looking to collect crypto. It's basically everything centered around that.
Yep. No, it's good. I'm a bit. I was joking earlier, like all my friends are asking, how do I buy crypto? That's what happens when you're in the security industry. But it's fascinating. Not only on the uh, ransomware side, also data exfiltration now. And hey, I exfiltrated this data. I'm going to release it unless you pay me Bitcoin or what it name your cryptocurrency, right? It's just rather fascinating the more sophisticated they're getting, which is why you want to look at these different techniques and tactics. And most organizations have a difficult time even identifying the most basic techniques and tactics because of the complexity of products out there today in this space. And so how Blumira works is essentially we tie in within your existing environment. So whether it's Active Directory, Azure, we'll talk through some of the other use cases like firewalls, EDR, cloud infrastructure. But we once you tie in an API connection or logging via syslog, we essentially do all the work through automation and ingestion, parsing, intelligence, detection rules based on the data sets, and then helping with alerting, prioritization, reporting. And essentially, once we identify a threat, we surface that. If it can be automated, take action. If it can't, provide a playbook and actually what to do from a response perspective, to make it easy. So there's really not any work in getting up and running. And that's how we've taken what traditionally is a multi-year project or 6 to 12 months, depending on the organization's sophistication, down to a couple of hours. And we can do that across the tech stack, all the Microsoft stuff we talked about earlier. But what's even more important is broadening broadening beyond that. So we're addressing cloud infrastructure, the endpoint side of things, productivity suites, the host, and the firewalls as well. And really a complementary approach of leveraging what these products already do, but then being able to hone in on the real techniques and tactics uh, that are most common, that need to be surfaced to be taken seriously from an organization perspective. So that's really some of the highlights of like how we do that and what we do there from a value perspective. Any observations from a tech stack perspective as far as value on your side?
It's hard going between investing in a platform. We covered Microsoft today, and then doing best of breed or a combination. It's always generally a combination. So if you see all these different vendors and all these different security technology areas, Most customer environments are a good mix of all of these different products coming together. So to be able to integrate those, to be able to provide, correlation and context and data enrichment to help, provide better visibility and enforcement in your environment, I think is key.
Absolutely. So let's take a look at how this service works. I'm gonna pop my screen up and make sure can you still see my screen
Yep.
with the Blumira admin panel? You said yeah?
Yeah, I can see it.
All right, cool. I should have done this beforehand. I'll reset the demo. And kind of twofold. As that's resetting, I'm gonna hop into some of the first off places where you'd identify. So normally you wouldn't see much here. As I reset it, it'll start to populate. But I'll hop over just from a configuration standpoint to show how easy this is. So we have a sensor that goes within a customer's environment, and that essentially becomes the collector and integrates with your different products. So Azure Event Hub, for instance, put in your API keys, Office 365. I mean, this is how quickly we can essentially get to value. We could also do Umbrella, for instance, here. And then, as we look at Azure, I think, or Microsoft, there's also cloud security and some of the different ATP modules, and you install that. And then the host itself also works as a honeypot. So honeypot's something that's going to detect lateral movement or people trying to gain access to something they shouldn't have access to, which is a really high indicator of compromise. So we can just install that. And then anything else like, for instance, firewalls, you'd forward via syslog. Windows, we have a collector that would then send the Windows logs via syslog as well. And essentially at that point, you're getting to the place of value where you're starting to detect threats. And so, this is kind of full stack, a bunch of different demo examples that I'm going to walk through and show. But when we're talking to some of the different types of threats, we talk about, for instance, password spraying. And you're probably like, why are you pulling up Cisco AnyConnect when we're talking about Microsoft? Well, most people integrate a Cisco firewall for VPN access with their Active Directory. And so I can basically collect both those logs and start to correlate and discover, hey, we see an attack actually that's doing password spraying right now. And it's with this specific set of users. Here's the IP addresses. And then, naturally, you want to be able to take action. And so in this case, we can block the source IP address of the attack from Blumira. And that's going to now block using that Active Directory information on password spraying. We're going to then make a block on the Cisco AnyConnect firewall so that we're stopping that traffic before it even gains access to an environment. So pretty simple and easy and straightforward. Jeff, I'm curious, I know you guys work across different technology stacks a ton in consulting. Curious what your observations are as far as like the integration there and how that works between the technologies.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's key to have that sort of correlation and to be able to take, something from a independent source, but knowing that it's tied into AD and then sort of pivoting off of there and detecting a larger attack vector or a compromise that's occurring. So, not all tools are doing this. Everybody claims to have a certain level of AI and ML, but, just to be able to put that correlation together, I think is really powerful. We got a couple of questions from the panel, or to the panel. Yep. Braun wants to know who the top two competitors are, and this looks similar to Darktrace. Can you kind of describe how this is different from, say, a Darktrace or an NDR out there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first off, on the competition side, like it's rather interesting. I didn't highlight something here, kind of before I go and answer that question. I just want to show on the block side, we actually also can configure automation. So we can automate everything I showed you without human interaction. So it would just automatically block on the firewall. And then we also have like 15 different threat feeds correlated you can apply on the block list as well. So there's prevention there to anything that's egress facing. So and then one other thing I wanted to highlight, because I think this will start to make sense as I answer the competition question, is when you actually look at a example threat, you actually can interact directly with our security analyst team on that threat when there's questions. And so there's a little bit of concierge there where also works to our advantage, where it helps us reiterate the product really fast with our customers, which is cool. But you can actually interact to say like, hey, I don't understand this, or I don't know what's going on with this threat. Can you help me? And so that's something pretty unique you don't normally see in security products. But to go back to answering your question, right? There's kind of this gap in the market that we've seen, and we continue to see where up market, our competition traditionally, and they're everywhere, but it's a Splunk where it's, hey, go do it yourself, or QRadar, or some of these other products, and they're good products. If you have the time and resources and the sophistication and a team of 5 to 10, 20 people needed to truly deploy, monitor, manage, and all that stuff, then they fit in a market. So I don't like to discount anything from like where we fit is the underserved market where they don't have the resources or time to respond to false positives, do tweaking, correlation, all that different stuff. And so we see them, but often it's a conversation around like, well, what's right for your business? Do you have the resources to deploy those tools? Is that where you want to spend your resources and time? Is one thing there. And then the other side would be full outsource. So you see like an Arctic Wolf or certain managed service providers that are like, we'll just do your full stack SOC. That ends up being really expensive. And unfortunately, you lose a lot of control when you do that. And it's right for some organizations, from an approach perspective, but most organizations also can't afford that. And so there's kind of been this gap in the market where there's not accessible detection there to organizations that I would consider to be small to mid-size, or maybe more manufacturing or different markets that have less information workers. So that's where we find we're really a good fit. And we always talk to customers about that, of like, hey, are we the right product for you or not? That's okay. It's a good conversation to have. And then I think the other question was regarding Darktrace. So that's more on the network monitoring side. It's a good tool. Our plan is to actually integrate with that tool, not compete with it per se. Most organizations, that level of sophistication is a whole nother step in network monitoring. Certainly is something that's interesting, but it a lot of times results in higher false positives and other things. So we focus on that less and see more strategic integration between the products. And there's some other products like Stealth Watch out there that are similar, where we're focused more on high indication of real threat or compromise. If that's helpful to understand some of the differentiation there between how the tools complement each other.
Yeah, we fit Darktrace into sort of that NDR, NTA category. So if you think of ExtraHop, if you think of Stealth Watch, those are two products that are in that space. And ideally with this type of product with Blumira, you would be integrating those feeds and that data and correlating it into this platform. Another comment just based on, the whole, whether you go to an MDR to provide this or in-house, some people actually think an NDR is cheaper because of the cost of tuning and maintaining that particular tool. So if you think about like RSA NetWitness and other Splunk enterprise security, those require generally teams. There's a lot of things to tune and tweak and maintain and manage. And, I always say you have to have a PhD in those products. And so you have to, employ large, expensive senior staff members to be able to understand those types of tools. And so most people don't want to outsource that work, but they find it's easier than maintaining a more, complicated tool. And so I feel like, Blumira is really filling a need there to avoid a lot of those costs and to get that intelligence.
Yep. Yeah, and that's kind of you look at it, it's like yeah, there's a significant portion of the market that doesn't have access to these tools and doesn't have the resources to deploy them. That's a really good example where it's like, yeah, and those organizations range from hundreds of employees to tens of thousands of employees, right? Is the reality depending on what market they have, what budget they have, what resources, all those sorts of things. So, and sometimes I think we're a balance. People are like, you're not really a SIM, but you are. You're not quite full MDR, but you pretty much are. um and so I think it's kind of interesting, like we fit in these a lot of these different categories, but we also don't fit because we actually built a new model from an approach perspective that is a bit different. And I think on the Darktrace side, like here's a good example is we integrate with Cisco Umbrella. Umbrella is an incredibly valuable tool, and we have a few other DNS monitoring tools. And what's really valuable is it does its job of prevention, but it kicks off a ton of alerts. And so nobody even looks at the alerting at the end of the day, or most people don't, because there's so much noise. But what we did with our integration is only surface things like command and control or persistence, so that you can go, we focus you on looking into those things and not everything and everything that tool kicks off, to provide that focus and get rid of that alert fatigue and then guide. And what I found time and time again is suddenly Umbrella customers are like, yeah, I didn't even look at the console. Now they're like, oh, wow, I just found 10 different desktops that had Chrome extensions that were malicious that we didn't even realize or know about, that were persistently trying to do the same thing. And Umbrella did its job and blocked it, but it's like it didn't actually remove the root of the problem that probably would become more pervasive in the organization and actually be successful over time. So that's some of the example when we talk about those other pieces of value that we inherently provide, if that's helpful to understand. I'm gonna walk through one or two other things. One is example of domain account administrators being created. So we talked about auditing. So this is, domain level access to everything and everything. And uh, the person, either IT or security person, would respond to this. Hey, we're unaware that why this was created. What this actually does is I'm going to close out the finding. It's going to send an alert notification via voice, text, or email. And then when I go back to the dashboard, it opens up a new threat ticket. So this is Rogue Domain Account Administrator. And here we're actually providing a PowerShell script on what to do to take action and disable that account. So that's what we mean by like enabling someone that might not necessarily have deep or sophisticated skills to take action to reduce the risk. And then, some of the other examples, I'm going to scroll down the risk-based side of things. New Office rules created, as we kind of talked about earlier. And then, we also monitor via firewall and other connections for things like public IP addresses connecting via RDP or via Windows logs, right? And so that's a good indicator of like, hey, something's not right if public IP address is connecting over RDP to a host or several other protocols as well, if that's helpful to understand. So.
Another question coming in. Someone's asking if you wanted to see a report of the number of failed login attempts to our domain, a specific server over the last 30, 60, 90 days. Can you do that here?
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of fewfold. I'm gonna laugh. You're gonna laugh, but we're happy to give you a demo one-on-one. The reporting data I have in a separate account, and I can try and log into it. I don't know if my credentials are right, but we can report on any of the data that we're collecting, and so we have both report builder. And so a good example would be going, and I don't have data on this account, which is why I mentioned, sorry, wasn't ready for that one, but good question. But we can see commonly like account lockouts, password failed attempts is probably the #1 thing people are reviewing on their own. And that also rolls up from a dashboard perspective, so I can see, hey, who are the top failed user accounts and how many times. So both those things are available in product. And really on the reporting side, any data source that we integrate with, you have pre-built reporting as well. that you can pull up. So good question. Sorry I wasn't ready on the fly to demo the reporting piece, but happy to hop on a call with you after today
So
to show
you
some of that
covered
too.
the dynamic block lists and the firewalls, which I think is pretty cool. What other types of built-in automations do you guys have?
Yeah, it's a good question. So right now, majority of automation is with the firewalls. And a lot of that has to do with the amount of noise on the firewall side. What we're working towards on the automation side right now is more actions for cloud applications like Azure, Active Directory, for example. So being able to shut down an account, for example. And then EDR is another common one. So, hey, I have maybe Mimi Cats here, I want to actually be able to just click so that Carbon Black or CrowdStrike or Defender or AMP basically isolates that host automatically by clicking that button and validating. So those are some of the additional automations that we're building into the product right now to extend a bit further beyond where we focus on the automation steps today. So it's good. And then the last thing I would say on automation is like really the secret sauce, and I think this is why like you have a SIEM, you have a SOAR, and then you need this team of people to do it. Is like we automated all our automation was actually focused on getting time to security value on the front end. And I think that's one of the challenges with the industry is like they actually spend all the time to try and focus on back end automation that most organizations never get to, frankly. And so since we kind of built from the ground up, we're really well built from a scale perspective to continue to grow as we reiterate on the product. So cool. Hey, I talked a lot about Blumira. You want to add anything as far as worldwide technologies, how you guys work? Would love to hear that, and for everyone else on here to hear as well.
Yeah, sure. So WWT is a global solutions provider. We support a number of products, not only in this space, but in security. I think we transacted with about 100 different OEMs. I mean, that's out of 200 total for our company, and our company's $14 billion in revenue. So there's a lot to get through. There's a lot of products to try to figure out who's doing what. We do tons of comparisons. I know a lot of vendors don't like to get into what they call a knife fight between, feature to feature comparison. And so we really focus on secure outcomes for our customers and right sizing and trying to figure out which of these solutions can really provide a lot of value and to be a great fit for a number of reasons, not just who's the best in breed technically, but we look operationally, we look at different cost models, that sort of thing, so we can provide the most impact. And so we've got a lab that we've invested about $800 million in. It's our Advanced Technology Center. It resides not only in St. Louis, but across 4 data centers. We have a footprint in Equinix. We have a lot of on-demand labs that you can access there. If you want to maybe go to our website real quick, WWT.com. I'll show you guys how to get registered. There's 20,000 VMs. There's a lot of automation on top to bring you a unique experience with a lot of products to be integrated. I have high hopes that we'll have Blumira in there relatively soon, but they have a great demo on their own. But if you guys want to take a look and maybe see what else is out there and what we can provide, not only in products, but also providing various degrees of consulting services and professional services to help integrate and get all these products operationalized and running to their full potential. So just a quick plug, I usually do a demo, but I'd love to do that maybe outside of that. I noticed some people that have attended, they've already seen a lot of that stuff, but I'd love to take it a little step further and just focus on the security aspect and all of these different products we discussed today and how they might tie into a solution like Blumira.
Awesome. Hey, well, Jeff, thanks for the time today. I think it's been fun talking about, some of the Microsoft risks and threats, how we can help organizations across the board, not only with Microsoft, but really the full tech stack from a detection and response perspective. And yeah, really appreciate the partnership with Worldwide Technology. It's great working with the team there, and appreciate you hopping on to talk with some of your customers and our customers about the partnership.
Yeah, thank you. It was great.
All right. Take care. Have a great day.
All right. Thanks, everyone.